Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm Michael LeBlanc, NRF Top Retail Voice for 2026 and Rethink Retail 2026 Top Retail Expert. This podcast is produced in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Welcome to Global E-commerce Leaders Podcast. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I am Jim Okamura.
In this episode, we sit down with Jes Crownover of Livingston International, a veteran logistics and global trade expert with more than 25 years of experience across UPS, FedEx, and international customs brokerage. Jess joins us to unpack the rapidly changing world of cross-border e-commerce, from tariffs and the end of de minimis to data readiness, supply chain resilience, and the growing role of technology and AI in global trade. Well, Jess, welcome to the Global E-commerce Leaders Podcast. How are you?
I'm great today. Busy. I got my hands full, but great.
Jim and I really appreciate you making time for us. Where are we finding you today?
I am actually at home in Memphis, fresh off of Manifest, WMX.
How was Manifest this year? I mean, it must be a big event in the calendar. And you know, it's funny. Everyone asks us all the time, how was the event? I don't know how you crystallize your insights, but you know, it was a good event, and whatever a good event means, but was it worth your time? How about we ask it that way?
I think it's great. It's almost like a family reunion at this point, but it's great to connect with partners, especially new partners. That face-to-face time is so valuable, especially when you get the decision makers and the people that you need to meet with. That's always important, and that's rather difficult in these times. So it's like a target-rich environment for me.
Well, speaking of face-to-face, we last saw you on the trade show floor at the NRF in January, but Jim and I had the pleasure of seeing you as well in New York over a dinner with colleagues. Jim, by the way, how are you? Where are you today?
I am in Chicago right now and doing just fine. Again, busy little stretch here, but really looking forward to some of the upcoming industry events.
All right, well, let's get into it. Enough, without further ado, and there's been much ado, Jess, we obviously all know each other, and you are a recognized figure in global e-commerce. But for those who may not know you, for our audience listening, share a little bit about your background and what you do for a living.
I actually started off right after the 97 strike in a UPS hub, worked in IPLD scanning, and worked my way up to Saturday air sort manager, and I kind of went from there. I've been in logistics on and off for over 25 years. Did a few stints outside of FedEx and UPS and AccuShip and some of the other companies I worked for, but 2 state senates, government, nonprofits, and then kept coming back to logistics. So here we are. Worked across 5 different operating companies in FedEx, managed their global project management across all the opcos, regions, and functional areas. And eventually got into e-commerce, and then eventually kind of got voluntold to go into global trade management and customs brokerage, and then made my way to Livingston about 4 years ago.
Well, you know, they say in retail that sometimes it's described as the accidental career. What when you were growing up, what is it that really gets you excited about the logistics piece? I mean, it's very complicated, it's fast paced, all those kind of things. Is that what attracts you and keeps you attracted to the industry?
Definitely. I think you get to be creative in a different way in solving problems and creating solutions. There's always a solution that needs to be created, basically. You know, there's nothing that stays the same ever.
As I said, if you want a boring every day's the same job, do not go into supply chain or anything connected with what you do for a living. Let's talk about Livingston. So I know a bit about Livingston. I know there's a bit of a Canadian connection, actually, but tell us about the scope and scale and what sets what they do, what they offer, and what sets them apart in helping customers win in global commerce.
Sure. Just as overall, we have over, we've been around since 1945, headquartered out of Toronto. Kind of all over now, basically have grown into all of North America, from Canada to US, Mexico, UK, Europe, and expanding from there. We serve over 30,000 clients across all different verticals. So it's a lot. You've got global trade management, customs brokerage, everything from consulting, you name it, business process services and freight.
You know, it's a great diversity of skills that feels like need to come together. Describe that for a little bit. I mean, you got to be a bit, you got to be sense of this always dynamic, got to be very agile. You're always thinking about just moving things, logistics. It's tech driven now. It's, what makes people successful in roles like yours?
Well, what I will say is that customs brokerage and international trade for a long time, it changed, meaning you could always expect change. But by and large, the form of it stayed the same, right? Customs, the way you did business with customs stayed the same. I think in the last decade, it started to rapidly increase in its volatility. So customs brokers, the way you did it didn't change very much. And now you're starting to see the entire shift of the paradigm move. So back before, there's that joke that you date your carriers, but you marry your broker. And the reason why was because of the power of the data. Your customs broker knows how to get everything across the border for you. They know you inside and out. They know you better than you know you sometimes. That's why you see a lot of like co-locations of brokerage, global trade managers on site with global companies. They're part and parcel of your operations. And now it's a little bit different because the power of the brokers was in the data, right? Well, now that's in the technology. So now what you have is you've got to figure out there's going to be a sweet spot of the marriage of technology and expertise. And really whoever solves that and is able to kind of go where the puck's going, to go where the future's going, that's where the sweet spot will be, right? So I think a lot of brokers, there's that book, Who Moved My Cheese? Their cheese has been moved. And so it's really about who can pivot and who can adapt into this world of VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, it's kind of chaos, but ambiguity. And so whoever can adapt in this is really who will win at the end of the day. I mean, and it's difficult, especially when your industry has stayed the same. Even when logistics and other pieces of it changed, customs brokerage didn't change. And I think that the pandemic and e-commerce and the entry type 86-321 program kind of, at least in the US, really shifted the paradigm and that need for more and more e-commerce deliveries. And it changed people's habits in such a way that it was a rapid expansion in a way that changed everything.
Well, let's shift a little bit, Jess, and talk about, how the market, has been changing, right? I'd love to kind of get your perspective, just in terms of a more macro, what's happening with global e-commerce, and then, maybe shift a little bit towards more recent, changes, and obviously a lot of the global trade disruption, let's say, in recent 12 months or so.
I think if we take a step back and we start at like 2020, we had a situation where e-commerce really took off. It was always growing, right? It was always, it's going to have this year-over-year growth. Every year, we always knew it was getting bigger and bigger. And really, 2020 was that year that served as such a catalyst that it changed everything across the supply chain. We had shortages, we had then overages, everyone had to pivot back and forth. But at the end of the day, it changed buying behaviors of consumers that now purchase online more than ever. They're more comfortable with it. Even the last holdouts you have basically converted because of that period of lockdown and the pandemic, right? So you saw this explosion of e-commerce, especially for cross-border. And people aren't going back. So even with de minimis being removed and everything that happened last year into the U.S., you're still seeing the same buying behaviors, the same consumer need for wanting things to be fast wherever the goods are sourced. If we look at 2025, I think it served as a catalyst in its own way. I think a lot of us in logistics didn't realize how much we depended upon the goodwill and trading partners that we have today. And strategically, we have to think different. I think brands have to think different. At the end of the day, look at what brands are having to do, nearshoring, changing their warehousing, changing every piece of it, because now we have to monitor even more so for cost reductions, for tariff mitigation, and for every little piece in between.
Was it a bit of a wake-up call, for the industry as a whole? And is that actually going to make, a lot of the clients even stronger kind of going forward because, they know they can't, in a sense, rest on their laurels?
It will. It doesn't. What is that? What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. I think you'll see things fall out. I mean, not everybody will survive this. I think the next 12 to 18 months are going to prove to be difficult for everyone. We're starting to see macro changes in addition to micro changes. Some customers that we've had or customers have pulled out of certain markets. They're pivoting because they either can't afford that market or it's not worth the cost of being able to serve them, especially if they lose money every time they ship. You're not going to make it up in volume. So we're definitely seeing people very strategically take a step back and look at their supply chain. Where are goods coming from? Now I can't depend on this. How am I going to pivot to this? We're definitely seeing sourcing. We're seeing return logistics. We're seeing a lot of key drivers being pulled apart and taken a look at separately. I think, like return logistics is becoming more and more important. Some companies kind of wrote some of that off, right? But if you look at like tariff mitigation, you're able to do duty drawback or credits, or depending on what country you're going into. And so they're taking a closer look at that to be able to reduce cost in this environment.
It definitely, that's consistent with everything that we've been hearing, from so many of the global brands that the strategic reviews, as you say, that have been happening in recent years, really kind of examining, the in some cases very long-term, partnerships, distributors they may have been using, and whether they're really what the brands need kind of going forward. Right. So I think we see a lot of that kind of pivoting happen. And Michael, if you ever get the chance to walk a trade floor with Jess, I mean, she knows, everyone. It's a great kind of, tour. But I wanted to ask Jess, in terms of, partnerships and alliances. I mean, you've always talked about just how important, that it takes a village, clearly. Right. And you're a part of that village clearly as well. But talk a little bit around the your approach to partnerships and alliances.
Sure. I would say partnerships make my world go round. I think that proves true in logistics. You're only as strong as your weakest link, and you're only as strong as your weakest partner. Not all of them work. We're kind of dependent on each other. It's our own little ecosystem, right? And you can find out usually rather quickly if it's going to work or not. I think carefully vetting your partners and building a strong collaboration is key. You've got to create that shared idea of mutual success, right? And if you skip steps in building that process, it's the recipe for disaster. There are some partners that, maybe they have the assets, maybe you don't. You have to be very careful to vet it to make sure that, if maybe you have a three-legged stool, you don't want one of those legs to fall apart because it'll all fall apart. So partnerships, referrals, we kind of all live in this world. It's amazing how, and you can see this in logistics, the role of partnerships, especially amongst small and big companies, is playing a bigger role, because I think we're all recognizing what we need, and that's collaboration across a wide array of services for our customers to be able to deliver. I may be good at this one piece, and a customer may need all of these pieces. And so whether you're offering this one piece, you still have to play well in that ecosystem of logistics partners and supply chain, value chain partners, right? At the end of the day, it takes all of us to build this together. No one truly does it well on their own. And so us working together just creates that value. And you have to make sure that your partners, that you trust them, you have psychological safety with them, that it's something that you work well going back and forth. Because listen, you're going to drop the ball, they're going to drop the ball. How do you do that? We actually have a meeting in my organization, and we call it removing friction. And what I love about this is that we have psychological safety of trying to figure out where mistakes were made, whether it was with partners, whether it was at this stage, in order not to make them again. I don't mind making mistakes, because I'll wonder if we're not making mistakes, we're really making the mistakes. But people being able to bring them forward, and whether it's with a partner or internally or whatever piece of it, to be able to work it out, because we are all dependent upon each other. And I think as long as we're acknowledging things happen and we're building, then that's a key piece of it. I think a lot of times it's really easy to say, oh, we're partners here and we're partners there. No partnership works perfect, but we're all dependent upon them. So how do you approach it? How do you treat it? And I think that viewing mistakes as opportunity is something that if you can collaborate with partners in that way, you really build something meaningful and lasting, and you bring that value to your customers and their experience.
Again, very similar to what we hear from the brands, themselves, the global brands who again realize that it takes a village, and they're always, seeking, really long-term, partners to really help them with their global challenge. Let's talk a little bit around, some of those operational challenges, for global brands who are trying to scale. Right. And again, I was reading around just the whole digitization of a lot of customs, processes and so on. So how does Livingston kind of bring some of these technology solutions, to help those retailers and brands, scale globally?
Sure. So we work with a lot of partners. We work with big brands, small brands, and we work with a lot of partners that are platforms. So it depends on kind of where you're at in your journey. It's a lot harder as a brand if you're not using a platform because they kind of take you through the full process, right? As you grow into bigger and bigger on a global scale, you might have more resources internally that understand. But at the end of the day, it comes down to this. It comes down to your data. So if you're trying to get your goods to move across the border one way or another, whether you're returning or importing, exporting, whatever it is, I cannot stress this enough. It's data, data, data. And if you can provide the right data, then you're gonna be able to be successful. And understanding what the right data is and being able to provide that will start. You have to take a step back and look through your entire chain and figure out, am I getting this here? Am I getting it there? Because by the time you get on the end of wanting to cross a border, you may be too late. And so being able to understand as you're building this out for the future, what those considerations are. And with technology, you're only as good as your data. It's just like AI. You get crap in, crap out. And AI modeling, and it doesn't matter how good the company is, if you don't have the right data, you're never going to get the outputs that you need, right? What we see is a lot of, whether we have APIs, which we do, or EDI, or whatever way you're getting your data across, right? Whatever level of technology you're at. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you need good data to be able to cross. And that's the most important piece. So being able to work with the manufacturer, being able to work to get all of the key pieces. So that way you experience less hiccups when you're going across borders.
That data readiness, is something I think we see happening, with so many, companies, whether it is from AI or whether it's, cross-border movement of, goods. So if anything, it certainly raises the profile of the strategic importance, of data readiness. And I do think that's something, we've been preaching for many decades in the digital, retail world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all ahead of our time. Speaking ahead of being ahead of our time, let's talk about AI from where it can take your business, from where it can take the industry. So let's assume, and it's a very, very big assumption, that the data is good, because as you say, if the data isn't good, AI is probably just going to get you to the wrong place faster. But let's make some assumptions that you've got pretty good data integrity and maintenance, and you got a pretty good regime there. How are you thinking about, and what are you hearing about the influence of AI and Gen AI in terms of moving the business forward? Is it, is it still a lot of hype, or do you see there a big transformation that many industries see? Are you seeing it in your industry?
We use agentic AI. We use other AI tools. I will say that it will be transformational to a degree. I think, for instance, I have great partners like ASAC and GTA, these warehouses. If I were to talk about AI with them, they'd be like, that's great. As they get these pallets moved from air side to truck side, they're fantastic at it. At the end of the day, we're still moving goods, right? Robotics, you're still going to need humans. From a brokerage side, there are things that they can do to speed up documents and clean them up. But you still require due diligence and reasonable care. So I think that there's a duality. A lot of people building AI are really good at the AI modeling. Do they know the logistics industry well? Not yet. I feel really lucky at Livingston. We had a company, Smart Border, that we bought years ago, and that Smart Border team was kept intact. So I actually have my own technology. We offered it to other brokers. We actually sunset that. So we had over 200 brokers kind of get kicked off of our system. We did an upgrade and I wanted it just for me. So a little selfish, but also, it's an advantage that we had. So why give it away? Right.
One of the things I talk to executives like yourself a lot about is trade-offs. And I'm going to ask you about a trade-off right now. So you got $1 left in your budget or 1 minute left in your day, however we want to frame it. And would you invest in new technology, or would you invest in deepening regulatory compliance expertise if you had to make that choice? What's that trade-off for you? Where would you put that last dollar?
Well, I'm saying this from an expertise. Technology would be hands down where I put the money. But I'm saying it from the expertise of we're expertise rich, right?
Right. So
I'm saying that from a point of we have the regulatory expertise, and I think that investing in tech is where the industry is going. So, I think what I mentioned before about the expertise and the technology, the marriage of those things, the technology, being able to marry those things together and continually improve upon it is what's really going to be where the industry goes. It's going to be hand in hand, but because I'm expertise rich, I'm going to say technology.
Well, it's an interesting point because I think it gets back to what your answer to Jim's question about partnerships, right? You can't be great in everything. And I think that's, outside of the expertise in Livingston as our listeners think about it, they may or may not have the same resources or history. They this is really helping them kind of stitch together where and how and where I need and where to go find that expertise.
So let's talk about some of the common customs and compliance pitfalls or challenges, that consumer brands, might face when you're engaging, maybe, onboarding with a new, client. What do you see as kind of these common, pitfalls that a lot of clients fall into?
Sure. Well, I'll go back to data. Your marketing description is not your customs description. Your marketing description is not your customs description. So customs wants to know, is it woven? Is it knitted, this shirt? What is it comprised of? There's all of these things. Now, at the end of the day, maybe it doesn't make too much on tariffs, but you have to be very, very careful. There's a company actually in LA last year, a textile manufacturer. They continually undervalued their goods, and they're likely going to do jail time in addition to heavy penalties. I would say making sure that your customs information is on point, making sure that your values, you are not undervaluing your goods. Cost of goods sold is relative to what CBP determines your cost, not your actual cost. It is cost plus. So being able to understand and have someone help you navigate that is key. Being able to have someone help you understand, like, okay, I have this data from the manufacturer. Because I always tell you this, if you send something that says snakeskin and it's a print, it's probably going to get flagged by wildlife. It's, there are so many things that can go wrong, but there's really easy tips and tricks on the front end if you can educate yourself, right? Like sunglasses versus polarized sunglasses. One is checked by the FDA, one is not. Most people don't know that. So even in textiles, even if you're selling clothing, there's things that can get flagged and you want to try to prevent it on the front end, right? And you want to have that information so that they pass through quick and easy without being flagged because you're missing critical pieces of information. When you're dealing with goods that have participating government agencies, in Canada they call them OGD, in US they call them PGAs, whatever they are, if they require the review of another government agency besides CBP, you want to make sure you get ahead of it. Like for food, you need prior notice with FDA. There's like certain pieces that you just have to make sure that you're doing in advance to be able to meet that customs info. And I think a lot of brands don't necessarily know that till it gets stuck. Or maybe everything was fine for a while and then customs started to notice. If you look at what happened, it was like a perfect storm in a way. In 2019, the ET86 321 program in the U.S., and let's look at it, it's a consumer-driven market. A lot of people import into the U.S., like a lot of companies. This is a key market. You had this wonderful 10 easy pieces of information, and for once, for the first time ever, these goods, PGA goods included, didn't get a duty and tax on it if they were under the de minimis per person per day, per $800 per person per day. And all of a sudden, these goods could clear. And then within months, March 2020, lockdown happens. And the only reason we were even able to get all of these goods was because we had a fast and easy way to clear them, right, without duties and taxes. And during the pandemic, it also fundamentally changed the workforce. A lot of people started working remote. So CBP lost a lot of people. They were overwhelmed and understaffed. And ET86 321, this e-commerce clearance, they were able to get things through fast without needing as many people. And so your customs data didn't require everything that it requires now. When the de minimis was removed last year in August, now you have to provide manufacturer ID. You have to provide other things that you did not necessarily have to provide unless you were doing returns. And so now the data is more and more important. And I think it will be. If you look in UK, for instance, they're looking at removing birds, the very similar to ET86 in US, right? Their clearance isn't going to be likely changed until a few years from now. But a lot of governments are looking at it differently. And they're looking at tariffs as a way to raise money for budget deficits. And there's a lot of budget deficits across countries across the world. So we're likely only going to see more complexity and more duties and taxes being charged across the board.
So there's always, just an ongoing education of, those compliance standards to let those brands, again, kind of get ahead of it as opposed to reacting, when something bad, is happening. You've mentioned, logistics, reverse logistics, a couple of times. Certainly we see this as kind of a hot topic. Are you seeing kind of the same thing? And where do you play into, again, a lot of the reverse logistics?
Sure. So I white label. I basically do the clearance going back into multiple countries. A lot of companies, they want to move the goods. And so if they've entered into the commerce of a country, they can be returned typically without duties and taxes or getting the duties and taxes back. And so we facilitate that clearance piece for duty drawback or for moving them back in without them having to pay duty and tax. And there's a lot of goods, especially with Canada and US, northbound, southbound, that we can solve that for. And so you see a lot of bonded warehouses being used. We have some great ones like GTA in Mississauga and Toronto, and they may move goods down south, like to JFK and maybe like ASAC, and then you move it back up. So depending on the direction that you need a broker to be able to help you facilitate that, because you need a licensed broker to be able to do that. So we do that for platforms. We do it for large brands. And there's a lot of movement there. We're seeing a lot of movement in that space. So maybe, you especially for textiles, but for a lot of other goods. And everyone's trying to solve it, especially for duty drawback right now.
Which, again, all that just seems to be a positive for the industry. Again, we're addressing, really margin opportunities, it seems like. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about consumer expectations and your, I'd love to get your perspective on the shifts in consumer expectations and how that may be driving changes in cross-border, delivery, for e-commerce and marketplaces.
Yeah. I will say this, before last year, no one knew what tariffs were or what I did, and now everyone seems to know. So regular consumers now are paying attention.
You're getting invited to a lot of cocktail parties. Explain this to us, Jess. What does this all mean? Who pays for these things?
Nobody wants to be the belle of this ball. I think that at the end of the day, there's a lot more awareness and a lot more understanding to some degree. There's been something interesting, and I actually received one. I thought it was great. I ordered something off of a platform, and I received it. And a few weeks later, I get a bill from an integrator, from a carrier, that gave me my duty and tax bill. And basically, had minimums and everything else, which I could translate. But if I were a random consumer and I received a separate bill in the mail, and I had paid everything at checkout and didn't realize it was DDU, basically they didn't pay the duties and taxes up front. And then I get this bill, it's shock. Or if they're not calculating it right and they have to come back and get it, it's a big deal. And I think a lot of consumers know now that duties and taxes are calculated anytime there's something cross-border, but they may or may not be aware that it's actually being moved across the border. And so I think a lot more consumers are cognizant of where goods come from and how it affects them now, because they're directly affected with de minimis being removed.
Mm-hmm. It's such a great point. How many people in my social circle had ever heard the word de minimis before. Like now we're speaking Latin. So it's kind of, it's a whole new level of understanding of what we do. I got one quick question for you, then I'll throw the mic back to Jim to bring us home, wrap up. Well, this is such a great discussion. I want to turn your mind to the future. So if you're a brand or talking to a brand or retailer, whoever you're speaking with, what kind of unique challenges do you see for the rest of the year and into next year? I mean, we've gone through a fair bit of time of, the re-swizzling of tariff regs and, the end of de minimis and, things move, up to even last week, different legislation is going to live or going to die on the order table or whatever. But basically, if you had to sum it up and you were saying, listen, whether you're a brand or retailer, here's the things you really need to be thinking about now and in the future if you're going to really scale globally.
Sure. So it goes under this theme. They say there's, they used to say there's two things that you always have, and that's death and taxes. I would say change, death, and taxes, and in particular, the change in taxes in this realm. Now that we're aware of duties and taxes and change, I don't think that this is going to settle down anytime soon. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of volatility still happening. I mean, look what happened just Friday. You've got the Supreme Court ruling that invalidated the IEEPA tariffs. There's a lot of change on the horizon. We, especially with this administration, you don't know. And so I think being in this space of being uncomfortable and understanding that you're just going to have to figure things out and you have to build, I think what we talked about with partnerships is where you're going to have trusted partners that are going to help you navigate this and be able to be flexible and have grace and space, because nothing's going to go right exactly. And if it is, you maybe should worry. There may be other things that are happening. And I think that this is that understanding your data, understanding your goods is going to be paramount in whatever you do. And getting a closer relationship with that is going to be incredibly important, because the only way you're going to be able to navigate the change is to understand what you have to be able to navigate with it. You're also probably going to have to look at pivoting differently. Some things were ignored in the past. They won't be ignored in the future. Customs is really stepping up on goods that are crossing borders. And we're seeing that more and more. And I think making sure that you have the right information with the right compliance is going to be key. A lot of things when you're overstaffed and understaffed and overwhelmed are really easy to sweep under the rug. That will not be the case forever. And so if you are a brand, making sure that the data and that your partners, everything is in line. I think that's the biggest piece of it. I think that AI can help, yes, but you have to understand what you're using AI for to help.
That's a great point.
At the end of the day, you're only as good as your level of understanding and education to be able to feed into that. And so I think that there's a lot of things that you can do in that realm, but having that basis to understand to be able to pivot is going to be the basic critical thing that everyone is going to have to become acquainted with.
I think, for a lot of consumer brands and retailers, just being prepared for that volatility you've just described, I think, is probably going to separate a lot of winners, from losers going forward, right? I mean, I think that's, as we've talked to, a number of the brands in the Gulf community, I think there was a greater optimism, for this year, obviously compared to last year's sort of uncertainty, right? So I think that's great that people are kind of getting back to growth. But it certainly, we feel like they have prepared themselves for exactly what you're describing. So, we're certainly feeling like we have a good outlook ahead, despite, again, a lot of these macro headwinds. Let's just kind of wrap up, on what are some of the issues that, retailers and brands might be surprised when you kind of say these are really essential or must-haves. What are those things that you almost start to educate them on, right out of the gates?
Well, we'll skip data because I've talked about data. I think part of it is understanding the process. So a lot of brands that I see, they don't understand the process of moving through their supply chain. The more sophisticated brands that have been around a while, that have a global presence, understand it. but there's different ways that you can shape it. And so understanding the journey of what your goods go through and understanding maybe this type of solution is better than others. A lot of them are just like, help me, help me, help me. And you want to help them, but then they don't understand the different pieces of it. And so a lot of what I do is education. Sometimes we get last minute requests, and it's difficult to accommodate when they don't understand a process and you're having to educate in the middle of a shipment being moved. That's never ideal. So trying to make sure that you take the time to understand on the front end as your goods are flowing. It's really too late if your goods are already shipped. It's a really tough position to be in. And we're in it a lot, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly. But being able to focus on understanding the process and the journey and the different solutions out there to get your goods to cross borders and for them to come back as well.
Well, Jess, this has been fantastic to have you on our Global E-commerce Leaders Forum podcast series. We really appreciate you kind of taking the time. We're getting kind of a glimpse into the your life, in the customs brokerage, world, and we really look forward to again, just some more interaction, with you and Livingston, in the future. So again, thank you very much, for taking the time to help educate us as well.
Thank you very much for the time today.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically each week. And be sure and check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast with Steve Dennis and the Global E-commerce Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, Senior Retail Advisor, Keynote Speaker. If you want more content or to chat, follow me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.